When we think of capitalism, we often picture skyscrapers, stock markets, or glittering banks. We imagine free markets fueled by innovation and industry. But behind the wealth of nations lies a truth often buried. Global capitalism was built not on freedom, but on bondage. From the 16th to the 19th century, more than 12 million Africans were stolen from their homes, chained and forced across the Atlantic. They did not just labor in fields, they generated fortunes. Sugar from the Caribbean sweetened Europe's tea. Cotton from the American South fed Britain's textile mills. Tobacco filled European coffers. Behind every ledger, every loan, and every ship's cargo lay human lives, reduced to numbers. Slavery was not a footnote in the story of capitalism. It was the foundation. Banks grew rich financing slave voyages. Insurance companies profited from policies that treated human beings as cargo. Governments taxed slave products, filling treasuries with blood money. The very logic of capitalism, efficiency, profit, expansion, was sharpened on the backs of the enslaved. Today, skyscrapers in London, Bordeaux, New York, and Lisbon still stand tall on wealth first extracted through chains. And yet, this truth is rarely told. We are taught to see slavery as America's tragedy, or a Southern institution, rather than the engine that built the modern global economy. This is not just history, it is the story of how our world was made, and why its inequalities still run deep. To understand capitalism, we must first understand the economics of chains. Part 2. The birth of profits, slavery as economic engine. When we look at the history of slavery, the brutality is undeniable. Whips, chains, and auctions. But to understand its true impact, we must also look at the numbers, the ledgers, and the profits. Slavery was not just cruelty, it was business. And it was business on a scale that reshaped the world. 1. The triangular trade, a machine of wealth. By the 17th century, European powers had perfected a system now called the triangular trade. Ships would leave ports like Liverpool, Nantes, or Lisbon, packed with manufactured goods, guns, textiles, and rum. These were traded on the African coast for enslaved men, women, and children. The enslaved were transported across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, where millions died in unimaginable conditions. Those who survived were sold in the Americas. Ships then returned to Europe with sugar, cotton, coffee, and tobacco. This triangle was not just a trade route, it was a machine, cycling human lives into profits. European banks financed the voyages, insurers underwrote the losses of enslaved cargo, and governments took their cut through taxes. 2. Sugar, the first global commodity. Sugar was called white gold because it fueled the rise of European wealth. By the 18th century, Caribbean plantations run on slave labor supplied up to 80% of Europe's sugar. The sweetener that made its way into every cup of tea was stained with blood. Sugar was so profitable that entire islands became death camps. In Barbados, Jamaica, and Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, enslaved people were worked to death at such rates that planters imported new slaves constantly instead of sustaining existing populations. Mortality was calculated into profit margins. 3. Cotton, the fabric of capitalism. By the 19th century, cotton had become the engine of industrial capitalism. The American South supplied 3/4 of the world's cotton, which fueled the textile mills of Manchester and Liverpool. Those mills powered Britain's Industrial Revolution, which in turn fueled global capitalism. The brutality was staggering. Cotton fields meant sunrise to sunset labor, overseers with whips, and families torn apart on the auction block. Yet cotton profits were so immense that by 1860, enslaved people in the U.S. were worth more as assets than all the country's factories, railroads, and banks combined. Human beings had become the single largest financial investment in the nation. 4. Finance, slavery's invisible hand. Slavery's profits did not stay on plantations. They flowed into the heart of the financial system. Banks. British and Dutch banks issued loans for slave voyages. American banks accepted enslaved people as collateral. Insurance. Companies like Lloyd's of London insured slave ships, treating human cargo as property to be reimbursed if lost at sea. Stock markets. Investors bought shares in trading companies whose profits came from slavery. Even universities and churches benefited. Institutions like Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge received donations or endowments tied to slave wealth. Cathedrals were built on the profits of sugar. 5. Governments and empires. European governments did not just allow slavery, they profited from it. Taxes on slave-produced goods filled state treasuries, funding wars and empire building. Naval powers like Britain patrolled seas not to end slavery, but to protect the trade routes. The American Revolution itself was entangled with slavery's profits. While revolutionaries cried, "Freedom," the southern colonies fought fiercely to maintain the system of bondage that made them rich. 6. The logic of capitalism, refined by slavery. Slavery was not opposed to capitalism, it was its laboratory. The obsession with efficiency, counting every minute of labor, every calorie of food ration, every whip as discipline. The focus on profit margins, calculating mortality rates into business plans. The drive for expansion, always seeking new lands, new markets, new bodies to exploit. Plantations were factories before factories existed. Slavery showed the world how to extract the maximum value from human life, and that logic did not die with abolition. It simply shifted into new forms of labor exploitation. Closing of Part 2. The story of slavery is often told as tragedy, but it was also an economic revolution. Without slavery, Europe would not have risen as fast, America would not have become an economic powerhouse, and global capitalism would not look the same. Slavery was not a side chapter in the story of wealth. It was the first chapter, and its language, efficiency, profit, exploitation, still shapes our world today. Part 3. The Industrial Revolution fueled by chains. The story of the Industrial Revolution is often told as a tale of genius inventors and technological progress. The steam engine, the spinning jenny, the cotton gin. But behind every machine was a hidden fuel: slave labor. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain's factories hummed with raw cotton harvested by enslaved people in the American South. Every bale of cotton that arrived in Liverpool or Manchester carried with it the sweat, blood, and broken lives of those forced to pick it. The textile industry, the crown jewel of industrial capitalism, depended almost entirely on slavery. Cotton was not just another commodity, it was the backbone of the global economy. By 1860, enslaved workers in the U.S. produced nearly 80% of the world's cotton supply. That cotton fed British factories, clothed European populations, and was shipped across oceans to markets in India, China, and beyond. Railroads, steamships, and banking systems all expanded to serve this trade. Insurance companies in London and New York grew rich covering slave ships and plantations. Factories boomed, ports expanded, and entire cities rose to prominence, not simply because of machines, but because slavery provided cheap mass labor to supply them. And it wasn't just textiles. Sugar, rum, tobacco, and rice all flowed through similar networks, each commodity building fortunes for industrialists, merchants, and bankers who rarely set foot on a plantation. The Industrial Revolution was not separate from slavery. It was built on it. When people celebrate the ingenuity of modern industry, they often forget that the gears of progress were greased with the lives of millions who had no freedom. The wealth of nations was measured in chains. Part 4. Finance, banking, and global trade. Slavery was not only about plantations and fields, it was also about banks, stock markets, and credit systems that made slavery the backbone of global capitalism. In London, Amsterdam, Paris, and New York, bankers financed voyages that carried enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Investors bought shares in companies like the Royal African Company, which shipped hundreds of thousands of people into bondage. Merchants didn't need to own slaves themselves. They could simply invest in the trade and profit from human suffering at a distance. Insurance companies like Lloyd's of London insured slave ships, even covering losses if enslaved people died during the voyage. To the financial system, black bodies were not human beings. They were cargo, assets, collateral. In the United States, enslaved people were often used as mortgage collateral. Planters borrowed money from banks using men, women, and children as guarantees for loans. A person in chains became a financial instrument, a line on a balance sheet. By the mid-19th century, the total value of enslaved people in America exceeded the combined worth of all the country's railroads and factories. This wealth flowed outward into global trade. European empires used profits from slavery to expand colonial rule in Africa and Asia. American banks in cities like New York grew rich from financing southern plantations. French elites funded sugar economies in the Caribbean. Dutch merchants reinvested slave profits into global commerce. Slavery wasn't just a brutal labor system, it was a financial system woven into every layer of global capitalism. Stocks, loans, insurance, mortgages, all were shaped by human bondage. Even today, some of the world's largest banks and corporations trace their early fortunes directly to slavery. The ghost of that wealth still circulates through global markets. Part 5. The Human Cost and Resistance. Behind every ledger entry, every bank loan, and every shipment of sugar or cotton stood millions of enslaved lives. The numbers might look clean on paper, profits, exports, investments, but those numbers were written in blood. On plantations in the American South, enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset, often 16 hours a day during harvest. In the Caribbean, the death rate was so high that planters did not expect the enslaved to live more than a few years. It was cheaper to buy new people than to care for the ones they already had. In Brazil, enslaved miners labored in toxic conditions, breathing in dust that destroyed their lungs. Children were not spared. Many were forced into the fields by the age of 6 or 7. Families were routinely torn apart, sold to different owners, scattered across states and continents. Enslaved women faced an added horror: sexual exploitation. Their children were often born into slavery, increasing the enslavers' property. But alongside this suffering came resistance. Enslaved people rebelled on ships, staged uprisings on plantations, and escaped along secret networks like the Underground Railroad. In the Caribbean and South America, rebellions shook empires, from the Maroons of Jamaica to the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt to create a free black republic. Resistance was not always open warfare. It could be subtle, working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness, teaching children to read in secret, or preserving African languages, music, and traditions. Each act was a refusal to be reduced to property. The human cost of slavery is immeasurable, but the acts of resistance, large and small, remind us that slavery was never just about domination. It was also about the struggle for freedom. Part 6. The Abolition of Slavery and its Aftermath. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, slavery had become the subject of fierce moral, political, and economic debate. Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality clashed with the brutal realities of human bondage. Across the world, voices rose demanding an end to slavery. The abolition movement was driven by diverse forces. Enslaved people themselves were its most powerful advocates, through revolts, escapes, and testimonies that exposed slavery's horrors. Formerly enslaved writers like Olaudah Equiano and Frederick Douglass shook public opinion by publishing searing accounts of life in chains. Religious groups, especially Quakers and evangelical Christians, declared slavery incompatible with faith. Activists in Britain, France, and the United States formed societies, circulated petitions, and staged boycotts of slave-produced sugar. Step by step, the system cracked. Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery in its colonies in 1833. France, after abolition and reinstatement under Napoleon, finally ended slavery in 1848. In Haiti, enslaved people had freed themselves through revolution as early as 1804. In the United States, the Civil War became inseparable from the fight over slavery, and the 13th Amendment formally abolished it in 1865. Brazil, the largest slave society in the Americas, was the last to abolish slavery in 1888. Yet, abolition was not the end of exploitation. Freed people often found themselves bound by new systems of control: sharecropping, convict leasing, colonial domination, and racial segregation. The wealth accumulated through slavery remained in the hands of former enslavers and their allies, while the formerly enslaved began life in freedom, with little more than the scars on their backs. Abolition was a victory, but it was incomplete. Slavery as a legal system died, yet its economic and social logic continued, reshaped in new forms. Part 7. The Legacy of Slavery and Global Capitalism. The end of slavery did not mean the end of its influence. In fact, its economic legacy became embedded in the very foundations of modern capitalism. The profits generated by enslaved labor in cotton, sugar, coffee, and tobacco had already fueled industrialization, global trade, and financial systems. After abolition, the wealth remained, continuing to shape societies long after the chains were gone. 1. Banking and finance. Many of today's largest banks and insurance companies grew rich by financing slavery. Enslaved people were collateral for loans. Insurance firms wrote policies on human lives, treating them as property. Profits from these transactions flowed into institutions that still stand today, though their foundations were built on exploitation. 2. Industrial expansion. Factories in Britain, New England, and across Europe thrived on cotton picked by enslaved hands. Textile mills spun it into cloth, which was exported worldwide. Railroads and shipping companies expanded because slavery provided both the raw materials and the markets to sustain them. 3. Post-emancipation exploitation. Even after slavery's legal abolition, new forms of coerced labor arose. In the American South, sharecropping and convict leasing trapped freed people in cycles of debt and forced labor. In Africa and Asia, European colonialism imposed systems that resembled slavery in all but name, extracting raw materials while denying native populations political and economic freedom. 4. Global inequality. The profits of slavery helped create the global wealth gap we see today. Former slaveholding nations accumulated capital and invested it into modern industries, while regions devastated by slavery, Africa, the Caribbean, parts of South America, were left impoverished, their human and economic potential drained. 5. The long shadow. Slavery's economic logic, the pursuit of maximum profit through dehumanization, survives in modern practices, sweatshops, migrant exploitation, and prison labor. The chain may have changed shape, but the system of valuing profit over people remains deeply embedded in global capitalism. Do you want me to push forward into Part 8, Resistance, Reparations, and Memory, exploring how descendants of the enslaved fought for justice and how reparations debates connect past to present? Or would you like me to expand Part 7 with case studies, like Barclays Bank, Lloyd's of London, or U.S. railroads built on slave profits? Part 8, Resistance, Reparations, and Memory. Slavery was not only about oppression, it was also about resistance. Wherever there were chains, there were also voices demanding freedom, dignity, and justice. And today, the question of reparations and remembrance keeps this struggle alive. 1. Resistance in its time. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways: revolts, escapes, slowing work, preserving culture, and teaching the next generation in secret. From the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to the Underground Railroad, these acts showed that slavery was never passively accepted. Resistance was constant, even if history books downplay it. 2. After emancipation, the fight for freedom's meaning. When legal emancipation came, freedom was not enough. Without land, resources, or political power, formerly enslaved people faced poverty and new forms of exploitation. Black communities in the Americas built schools, churches, and businesses, laying the groundwork for future movements. 3. The call for reparations. Reparations is not a new idea. After the U.S. Civil War, freed people demanded 40 acres and a mule, compensation for centuries of stolen labor. They never received it. Instead, former slaveholders in some places were paid for their loss of property. Today, the debate continues. Should descendants of the enslaved be compensated? Should governments and corporations that profited from slavery acknowledge and repair the damage? 4. Memory and forgetting. How societies remember slavery shapes the present. In Germany, Holocaust memorials ensure crimes are never forgotten. In contrast, many nations built wealth from slavery while erasing its memory through sanitized textbooks, statues of enslavers, and tourist plantation tours that ignore the suffering. Memory is power. Forgetting slavery enables its logic to survive in silence. 5. The global movement today. From the Caribbean community's demand for reparations, to African nations calling for acknowledgement, to movements like Black Lives Matter, the legacy of slavery is not just history. It is present. Activists connect past exploitation to present inequalities, insisting that justice cannot be achieved without truth and repair. Part 9. Conclusion and closing reflection. Slavery was never just about chains. It was about a system of thought, an ideology that reduced human beings to property, measured lives in profit, and built entire empires on suffering. That logic did not die with emancipation. It adapted, moved into new institutions, and whispered in the silence of forgetting. From the plantations of the Americas to the banks of Europe, from the auction blocks to modern prisons, the shadow of slavery stretches across centuries. Global capitalism, the wealth of nations, the rise of industries, the comforts of modern life, was fertilized by the stolen labor of millions. To deny this is not only dishonest, it is dangerous, because denial ensures repetition. But there is another thread woven through this story: resistance. The spirituals sung in fields, the revolts that shook empires, the writings, the protests, the voices that refused to be silenced. Every generation spoke back, creating a counter-language of freedom that still echoes today in movements demanding equality, justice, and repair. The question is not whether slavery shaped the modern world. The evidence is overwhelming. The real question is, what will we do with this truth? Will we let slavery's language continue, hidden in inequality, masked by neutrality, disguised as inevitability? Or will we choose another voice, the language of remembrance, justice, and liberation? The past is not past, it is present, written into our economies, our neighborhoods, our laws, our words. And until we confront it openly, slavery will never be silent. Final words to the viewer. If this history moved you, don't let it end here. Share it, question it, speak about it. The echoes of slavery surround us, but so too does the possibility of a new language, one built on truth and freedom. The choice, as always, is ours.